Last night on Christmas Eve, we started off, our gospel story was from the Gospel of Luke, and it is the story of Mary and Joseph traveling on this long journey, and they get to this stable where they have this baby. It's a very earthy story. It's this story of an infant in this dirty, very real place. And when we hear that Christmas story, it very much lands kind of in our everyday experience. People have babies, right? We have animals. We have everyday kind of places that we travel, journeys and difficulties that we have. And when you hear that story, it takes me back to the book of Genesis. There are actually two stories of creation in Genesis. The first story is the one where God speaks everything into being in 7 days. And then there was evening and there was morning on the first day. But after that story, we get to a second one. And that's where God is walking around the garden. And when God is walking around the garden, God forms Adam out of the dust. And God makes the animals. And then God, after a while, sees that it's not good for Adam to be alone. So God creates Eve out of his rib. And again, like the Christmas birth story of Jesus in the manger, it's a very earthy story. It has this sense that there's dirt and there's creation and it's all together. Now, when we hear that creation story, what I think it teaches us is that God is close by. God is amongst the people. Because in that story, God is walking around the garden, having conversation, and you get this sense that God is near. Now, it's not unusual if you look back at the history of religion for people to see God interacting, right, or the gods. In all of the old mythology, right, the gods would come down and be around people. But they were always powerful, and they had sort of these amazing presence, and they generally weren't always looking out for the well-being of people. So for the Christmas story, for Jesus to come as a vulnerable baby in a poor place with no power or authority in worldly sense is kind of an echo of this Christmas story of God being amongst God's people. But today we hear from the Gospel of John. And before we jump into that, we have a game that we play sometimes at our house called In a Pickle. So we're going to, I'm going to give everybody a card here. And then I'll explain how In a Pickle works. I think that'll be enough for that. So the way this game, we're not going to play like the full game, but you get a handful of cards, and then once you get your cards, there's a way that you play them, and each card has a word on it. And when you get the cards dealt out, what you do, and I'm going to have to collect these at the end so we can keep playing this in the house. But what you do is you set a bunch of cards up, and then the idea is, out of your hand, you have to play a card that the card ahead of it fits within. So, for example, if I had a box, and then you have to play a card that a box can fit in. So you might say library, if your card says library. But sometimes it gets tricky. Like if I had universe, you would think, well, universe can't fit in anything. But if you had the word dictionary, universe is in the dictionary, right? So this makes for some debates when you play the game about whether or not something fits in something. So we're going to start. I have seeds. Seeds are pretty small. Does anybody have something that's slightly bigger than seeds?
Shovel.
Shovel. All right. So she would play shovel on my seeds. Anybody have anything that's slightly bigger than a shovel?
Supermarket.
Supermarket. What do you got?
Turkey.
Turkey? Does a turkey fit? Can you put a shovel in a turkey? Probably not. Supermarket. So Paul is going big. So now we got supermarket. What can we put around the supermarket?
Mall around.
Mall. All right, that's a good one. So we've got the supermarket is in the mall. Curl.
Vacuum.
Vacuum. If we think of like a black hole as a vacuum, you might be going super big there. Do we have anything between the supermarket and a vacuum?
Nursery.
A nursery. So we could have a big outside nursery, like a huge one. There's one up in up that way somewhere. That it's huge. Like you can drive like 3 miles and you're driving by the nursery the whole time. That's good. Anything bigger than all of that? Okay, so that's good. That's a good first try. We won't play another round. But the way this game works is you're always trying to look for the thing that is bigger that encompasses what is before it. And when you think of the story that we hear on Christmas Eve of this little baby, of this Jesus that is close by, I think it sometimes is easy for us to imagine Jesus as a person and forget about the divinity of Jesus. And in seeing Jesus as a person, especially in our culture that we live in, there's so much talk about having this personal relationship with Jesus. And then I think we can maybe in our minds start to see Jesus as a little bit limited. Because if we imagine him as a person and we see him as a person, it's easy to start forgetting that he had this divine power. So then we hear the Gospel of John. In the other creation story, it says, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, God said, let there be light, right? God speaks and it happens. Not close up, not down in the dirt, just speaking. And you go through all of those days of creation. And even when it gets to people, God just says, let there be people, and people are created. So all of that God in that creation story is not the nearby God, but a little bit distant God that is very powerful and full of all of this might that even just speaking make things happen. So when you hear from the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word. It's looking back to that creation story where God spoke. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Which things came into being through him? All things. If you listen to the story as it goes through, all things came into being through him. Without him, not one thing. So from the beginning of this text of John, it's looking back to this creation story where everything is spoken into being. And then John comes to testify to the light. And light is amazing, right? It's everywhere. We talk about the speed of light, and light is just, it makes things grow, and it's all in the universe. So this light that shines in the darkness will not overcome it. And then John comes to testify to that light. And John says that this light is coming into the world, but then it switches gears and said he was already in the world because Jesus was walking around. And you work your way through the story, and it says the light was the light of which people? All people. John came so that all might believe. If we had kept reading, it gets to a place where saying in his fullness, from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. So when you hear this text from John, it's not about, we don't have a baby Jesus, we don't have Mary and Joseph, you just have this great theological statement that Jesus has been from the beginning. And so we talk about the Alpha and Omega being the beginning and the end. Jesus was there when everything was created. Jesus is the one that takes us to this end. And it talks about this big, huge sense of who Jesus is. And on Christmas, I think that's important because it's kind of like this game in a pickle. Instead of having a limited God, we have this God that encompasses everything. And sometimes we need that. When you have a deep grief in your life, you need God to be bigger than that. You don't need Jesus to just be someone you have this personal, heartfelt sense as a human being. You need God to be bigger than that grief so that you can have some hope that it will end. When we're living amidst war and violence, we need God to be bigger than all of that. Not a God that just fights back the way we do, not a God that seeks revenge the way we do, but a God that can take all of that and make it into something entirely different. In the season of Advent, we hear in the book of Isaiah that someday the peoples, all the nations, will climb this mountain to go see God, and their swords will be turned into plowshares, and that all things, violence and all that will go away, and there will be peace. That is a God that is bigger than who we are. And so on Christmas, as we think about all of the tough things in life and all of the bad things in life, we can take like these cards and think, what is bigger than that? And sometimes we think we have to work ourselves into health, and we have to work ourselves into wholeness, and that there are things that are just too much for us to handle. And that is true. We as people are limited. But God is not. And this story from John that says, in the beginning was the Word, and that all things are gathered up in that Word, all of the light is for us, all of the enlightenment is for us, the grace is all for us, and it's bigger than anything that we run into, is a wonderful way of understanding that Jesus came not just to be this cute baby, not just to be the guy that walked around, but to be a presence that actually transforms us into something new, because Jesus can encompass all that we are and gather us up. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to put this in the back.